Sometimes love makes us do things that change our lives forever. There's something powerful about sacrificing yourself for someone you care about, even when they don't know how you feel. Brynhild had watched her chieftain Ulfar the Bear from a distance for years, admiring his strength but never believing he could see her as anything more than another warrior in his village. During a hunting trip in the dangerous borderlands, she saw an archer's arrow aimed at his heart. Without thinking, she threw herself in front of it. The arrow struck her shoulder and she collapsed, but Ulfar caught her in his strong arms. When she woke up in his bed, her wound was bandaged and there was an iron ring on her finger. "You bled for me," he said quietly. "You belong beside me now." But their bond awakened something dark that neither of them understood. What ancient prophecy had their sacrifice set in motion? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the wooden palisades of Ironhold like the breath of sleeping giants, and Brynhild, Eric's daughter, had always found comfort in these quiet moments before the village stirred to life. She stood at her father's forge, working the bellows with practiced rhythm, watching sparks dance upward into the grey dawn. The bloodstone pendant at her throat, her mother's last gift before the fever took her, caught the firelight and seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth. At 23 winters, Brynhild had earned her place among the shield maidens through skill rather than birthright. Her father Eric had been a respected blacksmith, but his death 3 summers past left her with calloused hands, a keen eye for metalwork, and little else. The other women her age had long since married and borne children, but Brynhild found purpose in the ring of hammer on anvil and the weight of a sword in her grip. The sound of heavy footsteps on the wooden walkway made her look up from the glowing metal she was shaping. Ulfar Grimson emerged from the morning shadows like a bear roused from winter sleep, his massive frame filling the doorway of his longhouse across the village square. Even from this distance, she could see the careful way he moved, as if conscious that his presence commanded attention whether he sought it or not. Ulfar the Bear had led their clan for 8 winters now, since his own father fell defending their borders from Saxon raiders. At 31, he stood taller than most men by half a head, with shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of leadership that had settled on him too young. His dark hair, streaked with early silver at the temples, hung loose around a face marked by responsibility and countless small scars earned in battle. But it was his eyes that drew Brynhild's attention whenever she dared to look grey as storm clouds, holding depths that spoke of burdens carried alone. She turned back to her work, focusing on the spearhead taking shape under her hammer. It would not do to be caught staring like some lovesick girl. Ulfar had never married, despite the urgings of the village elders and the obvious interest of several eligible women. Rumour held that he'd loved once, in his youth, but the maiden had died in a winter fever before they could wed. Since then, he'd devoted himself entirely to protecting their people, forming alliances with neighbouring clans and ensuring their prosperity through careful trade agreements and strategic thinking. "Fine work, as always," came a voice from behind her. Astrid Thorn's daughter approached, her aging frame still carrying the grace of someone who'd once been the village beauty. Now, at 50 winters, she served as their wise woman, keeper of the old stories and healer of both body and spirit. Her silver hair was braided with carved bone beads, and her pale blue eyes missed nothing. "The metal speaks to me," Brynhild replied, setting down her hammer and wiping sweat from her brow. "Father always said I had the gift for it." Astrid picked up the cooling spearhead, examining the clean lines and perfect balance. "Your father was a good man, but he saw only half the truth. Metal speaks to you because you carry the old blood, child. The bloodstone at your throat confirms it." Brynhild touched the pendant reflexively. Her mother had worn it always, claiming it was a family heirloom passed down through generations of women. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a deep red stone shot through with veins of darker crimson, set in an intricate silver mounting that seemed to shift patterns depending on the light. Old blood or not, it won't change my station, Brynhild said, though without bitterness. She'd made peace with her place in the world long ago. Perhaps, Astrid murmured, her gaze drifting toward Ulfar's longhouse, where the chieftain was now speaking with his warband leaders. But blood has a way of calling to blood, especially when destiny stirs. Before Brynhild could ask what she meant, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Gunnar the Red, Ulfar's second-in-command and oldest friend. Where Ulfar was measured and thoughtful, Gunnar was quick to laugh and quicker to fight, his red beard and booming voice making him impossible to ignore. Astrid, still filling young heads with prophecy and nonsense. Gunnar's grin took any sting from his words. He'd known the wise woman since childhood and held genuine affection for her, even if he put little stock in her mystical pronouncements. Nonsense, is it? Astrid smiled back. Tell me, young Gunnar, do you still carry that lucky stone your grandmother gave you? Gunnar's hand moved unconsciously to his belt pouch, and his cheeks reddened above his beard. That's different. Grandmother's stone has practical power. It's kept me alive through a dozen battles. And what do you think made it powerful? Astrid asked gently. Across the square, Ulfar had finished his morning conference and was approaching the forge. Brynhild felt her heartbeat quicken despite her efforts to remain calm. She'd spoken with him countless times over the years. He made a point of knowing all his people, but she never grew accustomed to the way his presence seemed to make the world sharper, more vivid. Brynhild, he greeted her with a nod, his voice carrying the warm rumble that had earned him his Bear name. I was hoping you might have time today to examine my sword. The balance feels off since that skirmish with the border raiders. She accepted the weapon with steady hands, though her pulse raced at the casual trust he showed. A warrior's sword was more than a tool, it was an extension of his soul, and few would let another handle it so freely. The blade was magnificent work, forged by a master smith and decorated with intricate knotwork along the fuller. But as she hefted it, she could feel the subtle wrongness he'd mentioned. The pommel has worked loose, she diagnosed, running her finger along the grip. Not dangerous yet, but it's throwing off the balance. I can tighten it properly, but it should be done soon. How soon? Ulfar asked, and something in his tone made both Gunnar and Astrid look at him sharply. This afternoon, if you need it quickly, Brynhild replied. Is there trouble? Ulfar exchanged a glance with Gunnar before answering. Scouts report movement along the eastern border. Could be traders, could be raiders. We're taking a party out at dawn to investigate. I'll have your sword ready by evening, Brynhild promised. Good. Ulfar's grey eyes met hers for a moment longer than necessary. Your father trained you well. The clan is fortunate to have your skills. As he walked away with Gunnar, Astrid watched Brynhild's face carefully. He values you, the older woman observed. He values my work, Brynhild corrected, but her cheeks had warmed at the praise. Perhaps, or perhaps he sees more than you realize. Men like Ulfar, they carry the weight of everyone's safety. It makes them cautious about what they allow themselves to want. The rest of the morning passed in the familiar rhythm of forge work. Brynhild repaired Ulfar's sword with extra care, ensuring the balance was perfect. She also worked on several spearheads that would be needed for the scouting expedition, her hands moving automatically while her mind wandered. She'd grown up in this village, knew every family and every story, but lately she'd felt a restlessness she couldn't name. The other women her age spoke of husbands and children, of securing their futures through advantageous marriages. But when Brynhild tried to imagine herself in such a life, the picture felt foreign, like trying to wear clothes cut for someone else. As the sun reached its zenith, she took a break from the heat of the forge and walked to the village's eastern wall. From here, she could see the borderlands stretching toward the horizon, rolling hills covered in oak and pine, beautiful but dangerous. These were contested lands, claimed by multiple clans and home to outlaws and raiders who preyed on the unwary. Deep thoughts. Gunnar had approached silently, impressive for such a large man. Just enjoying the view, Brynhild replied. Will you be leading the scouting party? Ulfar insists on going himself. I tried to talk him out of it. That's what he has warband leaders for, but you know how he is about anything touching our borders. Brynhild did know. Ulfar's father had died defending these same borderlands, and the son had never forgotten the lesson that leadership meant being first into danger, not last. It was one of the things she admired about him, even as it worried her. The Eastern Territories have been quiet for months, she said. What changed? Gunnar's expression grew serious. That's what worries Ulfar. Too quiet for too long. Either someone's planning something big, or they're already moving, and we haven't spotted them yet. The afternoon brought a stream of visitors to the forge as word spread about the scouting expedition. Warriors wanted weapons checked, edges sharpened, mail repaired. Brynhild worked steadily, her bloodstone pendant growing warm against her skin as the forge fire blazed higher. She didn't notice the way it had begun to pulse with soft light, or how Astrid's eyes lingered on it with growing concern. By evening, the sword was finished, its balance restored to perfection. Brynhild found Ulfar in his longhouse, studying maps with his warband leaders. The great hall was built to accommodate the entire clan during festivals and gatherings, its walls lined with shields bearing the emblems of warriors past. Carved pillars supported the roof, each one telling part of their people's history in intricate scenes of battle and triumph. "Your sword, chieftain," she said formally, presenting the weapon across both palms. Ulfar took it and made a few practice swings, his face brightening with satisfaction. "Perfect. My thanks, Brynhild. Name your price." "Consider it my contribution to keeping our borders safe," she replied. Something flickered in his grey eyes, gratitude perhaps, or something deeper. "If all my people showed such devotion, I'd never worry about our future." "They do," Brynhild said quietly. "Perhaps more than you know." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken meaning, until Gunnar cleared his throat loudly. "If you two are finished, we have route planning to complete." Brynhild excused herself, but as she reached the door, Ulfar's voice stopped her. "Brynhild, be careful while we're gone. Keep close to the village centre." She turned back, surprised by the intensity in his tone. "Do you expect trouble here?" "I expect nothing and prepare for everything," he said. "But something feels different about this scouting mission. Trust your instincts and don't take unnecessary risks." Outside, night had fallen over Ironhold, and the first stars were appearing through breaks in the cloud cover. Brynhild made her way home through familiar streets, but Ulfar's warning echoed in her mind. She'd never heard him speak with such evident concern about a routine border patrol. In her small house, little more than a single room with a sleeping alcove and storage space, she prepared for bed by the light of a single candle. The bloodstone pendant seemed heavier than usual against her throat, and when she looked in her mother's bronze mirror, she could swear the stone was glowing with its own inner fire. "Just a trick of the candlelight," she murmured to herself, but sleep was slow to come. Outside her window, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant storms, and something else, something that made her dreams fill with visions of ancient prophecies and bonds forged in blood and sacrifice. In those dreams, she saw herself standing between light and darkness, her hand reaching for someone just beyond her grasp. She woke before dawn, with tears on her cheeks and the certain knowledge that everything was about to change. Dawn broke grey and cold over the borderlands, the kind of morning that made warriors check their weapons twice and keep their eyes on the horizon. Brynhild had risen early, unable to shake the restless energy from her dreams. Against all protocol and common sense, she'd decided to follow the scouting party at a distance. She told herself it was practical, someone should know what happened if they didn't return. But the truth lay deeper, in the way her bloodstone pendant had pulsed with urgent warmth when she'd watched Ulfar ride out with his men. Something was pulling her toward the eastern borders, something she couldn't name or resist. The hunting paths through the oak forest were familiar to her. She'd walked them countless times, gathering herbs for Astrid or tracking game for the village stores. Her feet found the quiet places automatically, avoiding the spots where dry leaves would crunch or loose stones might clatter. The skill had served her well during her training as a shield maiden. Patience and stealth were often more valuable than raw strength. Through the trees ahead, she could hear the low voices of Ulfar's scouting party. They were moving carefully, professionally, but their passage was still audible to someone who knew how to listen. Gunnar's distinctive laugh carried on the morning air, quickly hushed by his companions. These were good men, experienced warriors, but they weren't expecting an ambush on what should have been a routine patrol. Brynhild crept closer, using a fallen log as cover. From here, she could see the scouting party spread out in a loose formation, 6 men total, including Ulfar and Gunnar. They were investigating signs of recent passage, broken branches, disturbed earth, the cold ashes of a hastily extinguished campfire. Someone had been here, and recently. Ulfar knelt beside the fire pit, running ash through his fingers. Even from her hidden position, Brynhild could see the tension in his shoulders. This wasn't the work of traders or lost travelers. The camp showed signs of military discipline, and there were too many boot prints for a peaceful party. At least 20 men, Gunnar murmured, crouched beside his chieftain. Armed and organized, they moved through here 2 days ago, heading toward our northern grazing lands. Raiders testing our defenses, Ulfar agreed grimly. But whose? The markings on this fire pit aren't familiar. That's when Brynhild saw the glint of metal in the trees beyond the clearing. Her blood went cold as she recognized the distinctive shape of a drawn bowstring, black-fletched arrow nocked and aimed directly at Ulfar's back. The archer was hidden in the dense undergrowth, invisible to the scouting party but clear as day from her position. Time seemed to slow as her mind raced through options. She could shout a warning, but that would give the archer time to loose his shot before anyone could react. She could try to circle around and attack the bowman, but she was too far away, and moving through the brush would take too long. The arrow would fly long before she reached him. The only path that made sense, the only one that might save Ulfar's life, was the one her heart had already chosen before her mind caught up. Brynhild burst from cover, running directly toward Ulfar with all the speed her legs could manage. She saw his head turn at the sound of her approach, saw the confusion and alarm flash across his face as he recognized her. Behind him, Gunnar was shouting something, but the words were lost in the rush of blood through her ears. The archer's bowstring sang its deadly note just as Brynhild threw herself between arrow and target. The black-fletched shaft, carved with runes she didn't recognize, took her high in the left shoulder with an impact that spun her sideways and sent her crashing to the forest floor. Pain exploded through her body like white-hot iron, and darkness crept in around the edges of her vision. Dimly, she was aware of chaos erupting around her. Gunnar's war cry echoed through the trees as he led the charge toward the archer's position. Steel rang against steel as more hidden enemies revealed themselves, turning the peaceful morning into a battlefield. But Ulfar was safe. She'd seen him roll away from the arrow's path, his warrior instincts taking over even as shock registered on his face. Strong arms lifted her from the ground, and she found herself looking up into storm-grey eyes, dark with fury and something that might have been fear. Brynhild, Ulfar's voice was rough with emotion. Why did you? What were you? Had to, she managed to whisper through gritted teeth. The arrow had lodged deep, and every breath sent fresh waves of agony through her shoulder. Saw the archer, couldn't let him. Hush, Ulfar commanded, but his tone was gentle. Don't try to speak. The battle was ending as quickly as it had begun. The ambush had been broken by Gunnar's swift response, and most of the hidden attackers were either dead or fleeing back toward the deeper borderlands. But their purpose had been served. They'd confirmed the location and number of Ironhold's patrols, and they'd drawn first blood in what was clearly going to be a larger conflict. "Gunnar!" Ulfar called without taking his eyes off Brynhild's pale face. "We return to the village immediately. The prisoners—" Gunnar started to protest. "Can wait," Ulfar cut him off sharply. "Form up for fast travel, now." As they prepared to move, one of the scouts approached with the assassin's arrow, carefully extracted from where it had lodged in a tree trunk after passing through Brynhild's shoulder. The black fletching marked it as foreign work, and the runes carved into the shaft were from no alphabet any of them recognized. "I've never seen markings like these," the scout reported, "but the arrowhead is poison-treated. See how it's discolored?" Ulfar's face went white beneath his battle grime. Poison arrows were the weapons of cowards and assassins, designed not just to kill, but to ensure that even a glancing wound would prove fatal. If the arrow had found its intended target in his back, he would already be dying. The ride back to Ironhold passed in a blur of urgent haste and mounting dread. Ulfar had wrapped Brynhild in his own cloak and held her against his chest as his horse ate up the miles, speaking to her in low, steady tones whenever she seemed to drift toward unconsciousness. The poison was already working through her system, turning her skin clammy and her breathing shallow. "Stay with me," he murmured against her hair. "You don't get to save my life and then leave me to live with the guilt. Stay with me, Brynhild." Her bloodstone pendant, visible at the throat of her torn tunic, had begun to glow with an inner fire that pulsed in rhythm with her weakening heartbeat. None of the men noticed it in their focus on speed and survival, but the ancient stone was responding to something deeper than poison. It was reacting to the proximity of its destined mate and the blood that had been spilled in his defense. Astrid was waiting for them at the village gates, as if she'd known they were coming. Her pale eyes took in the scene immediately: the wounded girl, the grim-faced chieftain, the arrow with its foreign runes, and her expression grew troubled in a way that went beyond concern for Brynhild's injuries. "Bring her to my house," she instructed. "Quickly now, before the poison spreads further." But as they dismounted and Ulfar lifted Brynhild's unconscious form, the bloodstone pendant flared with brilliant light. The radiance caught everyone's attention, impossible to ignore or explain away as reflected sunlight. For just a moment, the ancient magic contained within the stone blazed forth, recognizing a moment of destiny fulfilled. And in that blaze of mystical fire, something else stirred. The iron ring, the simple band that had been Ulfar's grandfather's, worn by 3 generations of clan leaders, grew warm against his finger where he'd worn it since taking leadership. The 2 artifacts called to each other across the space between them, and when their resonance peaked, Brynhild's eyes opened wide. She spoke a single word, though none of them understood the ancient language that spilled from her lips. Then consciousness left her again, but not before Astrid had seen enough to know that the old prophecies were finally beginning to unfold. "What just happened?" Ulfar demanded, as they carried Brynhild inside. Astrid's answer was quiet but certain. "Destiny, my lord. The bloodline has awakened." Consciousness returned to Brynhild like a tide washing over familiar shores, slow and inexorable. The first sensation was warmth, not the harsh heat of fever, but something deeper and more comforting. The second was the absence of pain where she'd expected agony. Her shoulder, which should have been screaming with the memory of the poisoned arrow, felt merely tender, as if from an old injury long healed. She opened her eyes to find herself in Astrid's house, lying on the wise woman's own bed beneath layers of soft furs. Afternoon light filtered through the single window, casting everything in golden hues. But it was the weight on her left hand that made her breath catch in her throat. An iron ring encircled her finger, simple, unadorned, but unmistakably significant. The metal was warm against her skin, and when she flexed her hand experimentally, she could feel a subtle thrum of energy running through it, like a heartbeat that wasn't quite her own. "You're awake." Ulfar's voice came from beside the bed, deep and carefully controlled. He sat in a wooden chair that looked too small for his frame, his grey eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "How do you feel?" Alive, she said, then immediately felt foolish for such an obvious answer. The poison. Neutralized, Astrid's voice interrupted from across the room. The wise woman was grinding herbs at her work table, but her attention was clearly on her patient. Your bloodstone pendant saved you. I've never seen anything like it the moment the poison reached your heart. The stone blazed with light and burned it from your blood. Brynhild touched her throat and found the familiar weight of her mother's pendant, though it felt different now, more substantial, as if it had gained weight along with whatever power had awakened within it. I don't understand. Neither do we entirely, Ulfar admitted. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and gestured toward her hand. But that ring, it was my grandfather's. He wore it when he led this clan, as did my father, as have I. When your pendant blazed with light, my ring grew so hot I thought it might burn my finger. By the time I'd pulled it off, you were speaking in the old tongue, and your fever was breaking. I put the ring on your finger, Astrid added quietly. It seemed appropriate, the magic was calling for it. Brynhild stared at the iron band, her mind reeling. In their culture, rings were given for many reasons, as tokens of friendship, symbols of alliance, marks of betrothal. But a chieftain's ring, passed down through generations of leaders, carried weight beyond mere sentiment. What does this mean? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications none of them were quite ready to address. Outside, Brynhild could hear the normal sounds of village life, children playing, livestock moving in their pens, the distant ring of hammer on anvil as someone worked at the forge. But inside Astrid's house, the atmosphere was charged with possibility and uncertainty. That depends, Ulfar said finally, on what you want it to mean. Before Brynhild could formulate a response, the door opened, and Gunnar entered, his red hair dishevelled and his usually jovial expression grim. Ulfar, we need to... He stopped short when he saw Brynhild sitting up in bed, alert and obviously recovering. By Thor's hammer, you look better than you have any right to. The magic in her bloodline is strong, Astrid observed. Stronger than I expected. Magic, Gunnar repeated skeptically. Right. Well, magical or not, we have practical problems to deal with. The boundary stones are glowing. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Brynhild saw both Ulfar and Astrid go rigid with shock, and even without fully understanding the implications, she felt a chill run down her spine. All of them? Astrid asked sharply. Every damned one, Gunnar confirmed. Started about an hour ago, just after she woke up. Bright blue light, visible even in daylight. The whole village is talking about it. Ulfar was on his feet immediately, his warrior instincts overriding everything else. Post guards at double intervals. Send riders to our allied clans, they need to know what's happening. And bring me the elders. If the boundary stones are active after 3 generations of silence, we need every scrap of old knowledge we can gather. Already done, Gunnar said with grim satisfaction. Though getting useful information from the elders is like trying to milk a stone. They keep muttering about prophecies and destiny, but none of them can agree on the details. Brynhild struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the protests from her healing shoulder. What are the boundary stones? Astrid set down her grinding tools and moved to sit on the edge of the bed. Ancient markers, placed by the first settlers of this land. They were carved with protective runes and blessed by powerful magic, meant to warn us of supernatural threats. But they haven't glowed for over 60 years. Not since the last time the Dark Clans tried to break through from the Shadow Realms. Dark Clans, Brynhild felt, as if she'd fallen into a saga told around winter fires, where heroes battled creatures from legend. I thought those were just stories. Most stories have roots in truth, Ulfar said grimly. My grandfather used to tell of battles fought against enemies who weren't entirely human, warriors who served powers that fed on blood and suffering. The boundary stones were our early warning system, designed to activate when such forces moved against us. The implications were staggering. If the stones were glowing now, it meant the assassin's arrow had been more than just an attack on their chieftain. It had been the opening move in something far more dangerous. And somehow, her sacrifice and the subsequent awakening of the ring's magic had triggered an ancient defense system that had lain dormant for decades. "The arrow," she said suddenly. "The runes carved into it. Were they magical?" Gunnar pulled the black-fletched shaft from his belt, handling it carefully. "Astrid thinks so. She's been studying them since we brought it back. Blood magic," the wise woman confirmed with obvious distaste. "Designed not just to kill, but to create a connection between the target and whoever cast the spell. If it had struck Ulfar as intended, they would have had a link to our chieftain," Ulfar finished, understanding immediately. "A way to influence his thoughts, perhaps even control his actions." The room fell silent as they absorbed this revelation. An assassination attempt was one thing, violent but comprehensible. But magical manipulation suggested enemies with resources and knowledge far beyond what any normal clan could muster. They were facing something that existed outside the usual patterns of alliance and warfare. "There's more," Astrid said quietly. "The ring and the pendant, they're not just reacting to each other. They're resonating with something deeper, something tied to the very foundations of our land. I think your union," she gestured toward their joined hands, and Brynhild realized she'd unconsciously reached for Ulfar while processing the revelations, "has awakened powers that have been sleeping since the time of legends." Ulfar's hand was warm and calloused in hers, familiar despite the strangeness of their circumstances. When had reaching for him become so natural? When had his presence become the thing that made her feel safe in an increasingly dangerous world? "What kind of powers?" Ulfar asked, though his grip on her hand tightened as if he dreaded the answer. Astrid's smile was mysterious and tinged with worry. "The kind that either saves us all or destroys everything we've built." 3 days passed before Brynhild was strong enough to leave Astrid's house, and when she finally stepped outside, she found a village transformed by uncertainty and wonder. The boundary stones continued their steady blue glow, visible even in daylight, and everyone from the youngest child to the most grizzled warrior cast nervous glances toward the perimeter whenever they thought no one was looking. But it was the way people looked at her that truly marked the change. Where before she'd been Eric the smith's daughter, skilled but unremarkable, now conversations stopped when she passed and resumed in hushed whispers after she'd gone. The ring on her finger caught sunlight and drew eyes, its simple iron band somehow more significant than the finest gold. Ulfar had given her space to recover, but his presence was constant, a shadow at the edge of her vision, a warm voice checking on her healing, strong hands ready to steady her when fatigue made her steps uncertain. The attention should have felt overwhelming, but instead it felt like coming home to a place she'd never known existed. On this morning, she found him in his longhouse, examining a cloak she'd never seen before. The garment was magnificent, thick wolf fur dyed deep blue-black, with silver clasps shaped like running wolves. But what made her breath catch was the way the fur seemed to shimmer with its own inner light, much like her bloodstone pendant had done during the healing. "It was my grandfather's ceremonial cloak," Ulfar explained, noticing her fascination. "Astrid brought it out of storage yesterday. Says it's been dormant since his death, but now he lifted one edge and Brynhild could see faint lines of light running through the fur like veins of silver fire. It responds when I wear it. I can feel protection settling around me, as if the spirits of my ancestors were standing guard. The magic is spreading," she observed, moving closer to examine the intricate patterns the light made. "First the stones, now this. What else might be awakening?" Before Ulfar could answer, Gunnar burst through the door with his typical disregard for ceremony. "We have visitors," he announced grimly. "Ragnar Ironside and his war band, riding under a banner of truce. They'll be here within the hour." The name sent a chill through both Brynhild and Ulfar. Ragnar Ironside led the Raven clan, their nearest neighbours and historic rivals. The two clans had maintained an uneasy peace for the past 5 years, trading sporadically and avoiding each other's territories, but trust between them was thin as winter ice. "What does he want?" Ulfar asked, already reaching for his weapons belt. "Claims he needs to speak with you about the border attacks," Gunnar replied. "Says his people have been hit too, and harder than us. 3 farmsteads burned, 24 dead." Brynhild felt the blood drain from her face. If Ragnar was telling the truth, then whatever force had sent that assassin was operating on a scale far beyond what they'd imagined. "Did he say who attacked them?" "Warriors he'd never seen before," Gunnar said. "Dark armor, foreign weapons, and they fought like men who felt no pain. Ragnar's calling them shadow-touched." The term was from the old stories, describing humans who'd sold their souls to dark powers in exchange for supernatural strength and endurance. Brynhild had always assumed such tales were meant to frighten children into obedience, but in a world where boundary stones glowed and magic rings awakened ancient bloodlines, perhaps the monsters of legend were more real than she'd wanted to believe. "We'll meet with him," Ulfar decided, "but under full ceremony with all our war leaders present. If Ragnar is planning treachery, he'll find us ready." The preparation took most of the morning. The longhouse was arranged for formal reception, with Ulfar's high seat flanked by the chairs of his advisors and war leaders. Weapons were openly displayed, not a threat, but a reminder that hospitality had limits. Brynhild found herself assigned a place at Ulfar's right hand, a position of honor that would have been scandalous mere days ago, but now felt natural, even necessary. When Ragnar Ironside entered the hall, he came with only 2 companions, a gesture of either supreme confidence or desperate sincerity. He was a large man, nearly Ulfar's equal in size, with iron-grey hair braided with silver rings and scars that spoke of countless battles. His pale blue eyes missed nothing as they swept the assembled crowd, lingering on Brynhild with obvious curiosity. "Ulfar Grimson," he said formally, stopping before the high seat, "I greet you in the name of friendship between our peoples." "Ragnar Ironside," Ulfar replied with equal formality. "Be welcome in my hall. Share our bread and speak your mind freely." The ritual exchange of hospitality completed, Ragnar accepted the offered bread and ale before settling into the guest chair. But his attention kept returning to Brynhild, and finally he addressed her directly. "You must be the shield maiden who awakened the boundary stones." "My wise woman felt the disturbance 3 days ago," said. "The very air tasted of destiny fulfilled." "I am Brynhild Eriksdottir," she replied carefully, "and I am honored by your notice, though I'm not sure I deserve such attention." Ragnar's laugh was short and humorless, modest, but perhaps foolishly so. "Do you know what the glowing stones mean to those of us who remember the old ways?" "That supernatural threats are moving against us," Ulfar interjected, his voice carrying a subtle warning about the direction of the conversation. "More than that," Ragnar said seriously. "They mark the return of the chosen pair, the bloodline warriors prophesied to stand against the shadow when it rises again. My grandmother told me the stories, though I confess I never expected to see them proven true." Astrid, who had been sitting quietly near the fire, suddenly stood. "What exactly did your wise woman sense, Ragnar?" "Be specific." "Power awakening after long sleep, ancient bonds reformed, and something else, something that worried her greatly." His expression grew dark. "She said, the shadow-touched we've been fighting are just the beginning. They serve something older and far more dangerous, something that's been waiting for the right moment to strike." "What kind of moment?" Brynhild asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The moment when the chosen pair revealed themselves," Ragnar said grimly. "According to the prophecies, their awakening is both our greatest hope and our greatest vulnerability. The enemy has been waiting generations for this, waiting for you two to manifest your power so they could finally strike at the source." The longhouse fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Everyone present understood the implications. By saving Ulfar's life and awakening their magical bond, Brynhild hadn't just triggered ancient defenses, she'd also painted a target on their backs that their enemies had been anticipating for decades. "Then we'd better learn to use this power quickly," Ulfar said with grim determination, "because something tells me we won't have long to prepare." Outside the longhouse, the boundary stones pulsed brighter, as if responding to his words with urgent agreement. The alliance with Ragnar Ironside was formalized at sunset, sealed with shared mead and witnessed by both clans. But it was what happened afterward, in the privacy of Astrid's house, that truly marked the beginning of Brynhild's education in the old ways. The wise woman had prepared for this moment, bringing out artifacts that had been hidden away since her own grandmother's time. The most significant was a bronze bowl, green with age and carved with intricate spirals that seemed to move in the firelight. When filled with clear spring water, it became a window into truths both ancient and immediate. "The seeing bowl has been in my family for 15 generations, Astrid explained, setting it carefully on her work table. "It was last used during the shadow wars of my great-grandmother's time. I'd hoped never to have need of it again." Brynhild sat beside Ulfar on a low bench, acutely aware of the warmth where their shoulders touched, the wolf cloak draped over his frame, its silver clasps catching the candlelight, while her bloodstone pendant rested against her throat like a warm promise. The iron ring on her finger had grown heavier throughout the day, as if accumulating significance with each passing hour. "What will it show us?" Ulfar asked, his warrior's practicality struggling with concepts that lay beyond sword and shield. "The shape of what's coming," Astrid replied, adding herbs to the water. "And perhaps, if we're fortunate, the path to survival." As the wise woman began her ritual, Brynhild felt a strange tugging sensation in her chest, as if something within her was being called forward. The bloodstone pendant grew warm, then hot, and suddenly she found herself speaking words she didn't remember learning. "By blood spilled and bond forged, by ancient pact and modern need, let the waters show what must be seen." The bowl's surface rippled without any external disturbance, and images began to form in its depths. At first they were unclear, like shadows moving behind fog, but gradually they sharpened into scenes of devastating clarity. She saw armies of warriors in black armor marching across barren landscapes, their faces hidden behind masks that leaked shadow like smoke. She saw a figure wreathed in darkness, standing atop a mountain peak, arms raised as if conducting some vast and terrible orchestra. And she saw herself and Ulfar, standing together against a tide of enemies, power blazing from their joined hands bright enough to blind. But it was the final image that made her gasp aloud, a glimpse of a massive fortress carved from black stone, its towers reaching toward a sky that burned with unnatural fire. At its heart sat a throne made from the bones of dragons, and upon that throne— "Enough," Astrid said sharply, disturbing the water with her hand. The visions shattered, leaving only ripples and the reflection of candlelight. "I've seen what I needed to see." "What was that place?" Brynhild asked, her voice shaky. The image of the bone throne had filled her with a dread that went deeper than fear. It felt like looking into the face of absolute evil. "Shadow hold," Ulfar said grimly. "My grandfather described it in his war stories. The seat of power for the dark clans, built in a realm that touches our world only at certain times and places." "It's more than just a fortress," Astrid added, her face pale. "It's a focus for dark magic, a place where the barriers between worlds grow thin. If someone has claimed the Bone Throne again, after all these years—" She didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the implications. The attacks on their borderlands weren't random raids, they were probing strikes, testing defenses before a much larger assault. And at the center of it all was an enemy powerful enough to command armies from beyond the mortal realm. "The prophecy speaks of this," Astrid continued, reaching for an ancient scroll that had been hidden away with the bowl. It says that when the Shadow Lord rises again, only the union of two bloodlines can stand against him. The bear and the smith, bonded by sacrifice and sealed by magic. Brynhild looked down at the iron ring on her finger, understanding finally why it felt so significant. The bear, Ulfar's lineage, the smith, my father's trade, passed down through generations. More than trade, Astrid corrected. Your bloodline carries the gift of working with magical metals, of forging artifacts that can channel and focus supernatural power. That's why your father's weapons never broke in battle, why your own work feels instinctive rather than learned. It was true, Brynhild realized. She'd always assumed her skill came from careful observation and practice, but there had been moments at the forge when her hands seemed to know exactly what to do without conscious thought. Times when the metal bent to her will, as if it were alive and responsive to her touch. So what are we supposed to do with this knowledge? Ulfar asked. Stand against an army of shadow-touched warriors and their undead lord, armed with nothing but magical bloodlines and ancient artifacts. You learn, Astrid said firmly. Both of you. The magic that binds you is powerful, but it's raw and untrained. You need to understand how to channel it, how to work together, how to forge it into a weapon that can pierce the heart of darkness. How long do we have? Brynhild asked. Astrid consulted the scroll again, running her finger along lines of text written in the old tongue. The visions suggest the next new moon 10 days from now. That's when the barriers will be weakest, when Shadowhold can fully manifest in our realm. 10 days to learn magic they'd never believed in. 10 days to forge themselves into weapons capable of standing against an enemy that had been planning this moment for generations. 10 days to save not just their own clans, but potentially all the free peoples of the Northlands. Then we'd better start immediately, Ulfar said, rising from the bench. The wolf cloak flowed around him like liquid shadow, and for a moment Brynhild could see the power that lay dormant within his bloodline, the strength of ancient kings, and the wisdom of those who'd fought impossible battles and won. Her own pendant pulsed with answering light, recognizing its destined partner. When she stood and took his offered hand, she felt the magic flow between them like a circuit completing itself. It was still unfamiliar and sometimes overwhelming, but it was theirs, a bond forged in sacrifice and tempered by necessity. What do we do first? She asked. Astrid's smile was fierce with pride and determination. First, we wake the rest of your heritage. Then we teach you how to forge weapons that can cut shadow itself. Outside, the boundary stones blazed brighter, as if sensing the resolve growing within the village they protected. The enemy might be coming, but they would not find Ironhold defenseless. They would find the chosen pair ready to fight for everything they held dear. The training began before dawn, when the boundary stones cast their eerie blue light across empty practice yards. Astrid had insisted on starting with the fundamentals, not sword work or strategy, but the deep breathing and mental discipline that would allow them to channel their awakening powers without being consumed by them. Brynhild found the meditation surprisingly difficult. All her life she'd been a woman of action, solving problems with hammer and blade rather than contemplation. But now she sat cross-legged on a woolen blanket, trying to feel the flow of energy that Astrid insisted was always present, always available to those who knew how to listen. Don't force it, the wise woman instructed, her own breathing steady and deep. Magic isn't something you grasp with your will. It's something you invite, something you partner with. Feel for the warmth in your bloodstone pendant. Let it guide you to the source. Beside her, Ulfar was having his own struggles. His warrior's training had taught him to master his body through discipline and strength, but this required a different kind of control, a willingness to be vulnerable, to let power flow through him without trying to direct every aspect of it. This feels like drowning, he muttered, sweat beading his forehead despite the cool morning air. Because you're fighting the current instead of learning to swim, Astrid replied with patient humor. The magic wants to work with you, not against you. Stop trying to command it and start trying to understand it. It was on the third morning that Brynhild finally felt it, a subtle warmth that began in her pendant and spread through her chest like honey melting in sunlight. The sensation was intimate, familiar, as if she'd always carried this power but simply never known how to access it. When she opened her eyes, both Astrid and Ulfar were staring at her in amazement. "Your hands," Ulfar said softly. She looked down to find her palms glowing with soft golden light, the same warm radiance that sometimes emanated from her pendant. The light felt alive, responsive to her emotions and intentions. When she thought of protection, it brightened. When she focused on healing, it grew gentler, more soothing. "Beautiful," Astrid whispered, "the forge light of your ancestors. With proper training, you'll be able to infuse that power into anything. You create weapons that never dull. Armor that turns aside dark magic, tools that make the impossible seem simple." But their progress was interrupted by urgent news from the outside world. Gunnar arrived at the practice yard with a face like thunderclouds, bearing reports that made everyone's blood run cold. "3 more clans have been attacked," he announced without preamble. "The Elk people, the Stone Builders, and the River Folk, all in the same night, all by the same shadow-touched warriors. But this time, they didn't just raid and retreat, they took prisoners. The implications were staggering. Coordinated attacks across such a wide area suggested an enemy force far larger than anyone had imagined. And taking prisoners meant whatever they were planning required living captives, which raised possibilities too dark to contemplate comfortably. "How many taken?" Ulfar asked, already reaching for his weapons. "Nearly 100, from what the survivors report," Gunnar replied grimly. "Mostly young people, both men and women. They're being herded toward the eastern mountains, toward the old places where the barriers between worlds are thinnest." Astrid's face went pale as understanding dawned. "Blood sacrifice," she said quietly. "The Shadow Lord needs life force to fully manifest in our realm. 100 souls would provide more than enough power for the ritual." The war horn that suddenly echoed across the village was not their own. It came from the direction of the eastern borders, long and mournful, with undertones that made everyone who heard it feel hollow and afraid. It was answered moments later by similar calls from the north and south. The enemy was surrounding them, cutting off escape routes and preparing for something massive. "They're not waiting for the new moon," Ulfar realized with growing alarm. "They're accelerating their timeline." A messenger arrived at a dead run, his horse lathered with sweat and his face marked by exhaustion and terror. "Chieftain," he gasped. "Shadow-touched warriors massing beyond the eastern ridge. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. And something else, something that makes the air itself feel wrong." Before anyone could respond, Ragnar Ironside appeared with his own warband, their faces grim but determined. "My scouts report the same from the western approaches," he announced. "We're cut off, surrounded by forces that shouldn't exist in the mortal realm. But there's more. My wise woman has been scrying through the night. She says the Bone Throne has already been claimed." The news hit like a physical blow. According to the prophecies, the Shadow Lord's full manifestation required both the Bone Throne and the blood sacrifice. If he'd already claimed his seat of power, then their timeline had collapsed from days to hours. "Who?" Astrid asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. "Malakar, the Soul Render," Ragnar replied, and several warriors made protective signs at the mention of the name, the same dark sorcerer who led the Shadow Wars 60 years ago. "We thought he was dead, destroyed, when his first attempt at conquest failed. But death and undeath are different things for those who traffic with such powers." Brynhild felt the blood drain from her face. She'd heard that name in childhood nightmares, whispered by parents to frighten disobedient children into compliance. Malakar was the monster from the darkest stories, the enemy who turned victory into defeat through sheer malevolent will. If he's already claimed the throne, why hasn't he attacked? Ulfar asked. Because he's smart enough to remember what happened last time, Astrid said grimly. The chosen pair of that generation nearly destroyed him, cost him decades of accumulated power. This time he wants to be certain of victory before he commits to battle. A new sound reached them then, not a war horn, but something far worse. It was singing, if the word could be applied to voices that carried no human warmth or joy. The melody was hauntingly beautiful and utterly wrong, designed to seep into the mind and weaken resolve. Siren song, Ragnar identified with obvious disgust. They're trying to charm our defenders into laying down their weapons. But as the ethereal voices washed over the village, something unexpected happened. Brynhild's pendant blazed with protective light, and Ulfar's wolf cloak stirred as if moved by unfelt wind. The magic that bound them together formed a barrier against the hostile enchantment, keeping their minds clear and their wills strong. "The bond protects us," Astrid said with satisfaction. "But only us, the others." She gestured toward the village, where people were beginning to wander out of their houses with dreamy expressions, drawn by the supernatural music toward whatever fate awaited them beyond the walls. "We have to break the enchantment," Brynhild said urgently, "before they march our people to slaughter." Ulfar nodded grimly, his hand moving to the ancient war horn that hung at his side. "Then it's time to test our training under actual battle conditions." The war horn of calling had been silent for 3 generations, its ancient bronze green with age and its surface carved with runes that seemed to shift in the morning light. When Ulfar raised it to his lips, Brynhild felt the magic within her respond immediately, as if the artifact had been waiting for this moment, for their combined power to awaken its true potential. The note that rang out across Ironhold was unlike anything she'd ever heard, not just sound, but pure will made audible, cutting through the enemy's enchantment like a sword through silk. The ethereal singing faltered, then died completely, leaving an abrupt silence that felt almost violent in its intensity. Throughout the village, people shook their heads as if waking from deep sleep, confusion replacing the dreamy compliance that had been drawing them toward the gates. Children cried out for their parents, warriors reached for weapons they'd nearly abandoned, and the elderly muttered prayers of gratitude to gods they'd almost forgotten. "Impressive," came a voice from the shadows near the eastern gate, but ultimately futile. The figure that stepped into view was tall and elegant, dressed in dark robes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was aristocratically handsome, unmarked by age or battle, but his eyes held depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades. When he smiled, it was with the confidence of someone who held all the important cards in a game his opponents didn't even understand they were playing. "Malakar," Astrid breathed, her voice tight with old hatred. "Dear Astrid," the sorcerer replied with mock warmth. "Still playing with herbs and folk remedies, I see. How quaint. And you must be the latest chosen pair. How wonderfully predictable the prophecies are, always providing exactly what's needed at exactly the right moment." Ulfar stepped forward, his hand on his sword hilt, but Malakar raised one finger in gentle admonishment. "I wouldn't recommend violence just yet, young chieftain. Your people are still alive, after all, and I'd hate for that situation to change unnecessarily." "What do you want?" Brynhild demanded, her pendant blazing with protective light. "Want?" Malakar laughed, the sound beautiful and terrible. "My dear girl, I already have everything I want. The question is, what you're willing to sacrifice to keep what you think you have." He gestured, and the air around him shimmered like heat rising from summer stone. When the distortion cleared, they could see into the enemy encampment beyond the village walls, and what they saw made Brynhild's heart clench with despair. The captured villagers from the other clans weren't the only prisoners. Arranged in neat rows within a circle of standing stones were dozens of people from Ironhold itself, villagers who should have been safe within their walls, including several she recognized as friends and neighbors. "Impossible," Gunnar snarled. "The gates have been watched. No one got through our defenses." "No one needed to," Malakar replied pleasantly. "You see, the truly beautiful thing about this plan is that I didn't have to breach your defenses at all. Your people came to me willingly, convinced they were following the orders of their beloved chieftain." The implications hit Ulfar like a physical blow. "A shape changer. Someone wearing my face." "Close, but not quite," the sorcerer corrected. "Something far more elegant than crude shape-shifting. Tell me, young Brynhild, what do you know about the bloodline ritual that bound you to your chieftain?" Astrid's face went white with understanding. "The blood oath blade," she whispered. "You've been planning this for years." Malakar's smile widened, showing teeth that gleamed too white in the morning light. "Decades. Actually, you see, the ritual that created your precious bond required a catalyst, something to awaken the sleeping magic in your bloodlines. The assassin's arrow wasn't meant to kill Ulfar. It was meant to force exactly the sacrifice that occurred." He produced a ceremonial dagger from within his robes, its blade marked with runes that hurt to look at directly. The metal was stained dark with what looked like old blood, and when he held it up, both Brynhild and Ulfar felt their magical bond twist with sudden pain. "This blade was used to seal your union," Malakar continued conversationally. "A beautiful piece of work. Really, it creates a mystical connection between bonded souls that can be manipulated by anyone who knows the proper techniques. Every order Ulfar gave to your people, every command they followed so trustingly, was channeled through your bond to his voice. The betrayal was staggering in its scope and cruelty. Brynhild realized that their magical connection, the thing that had felt like destiny and salvation, had been compromised from the very beginning. The enemy hadn't just predicted their awakening, he'd orchestrated it, shaped it to serve his own purposes. "You're lying," Ulfar said, but his voice lacked conviction. Too many pieces were falling into place, too many strange coincidences suddenly making terrible sense. "Am I?" Malakar asked with false sympathy. "Think carefully about the past few days, how convenient it was that young Brynhild happened to be in the forest at exactly the right moment. How perfectly the arrow's trajectory was aligned to ensure her sacrifice would awaken both bloodlines simultaneously. How quickly the boundary stones responded to your union, as if they'd been primed to do exactly that." Brynhild felt sick as memories took on new and sinister significance. Her restless dreams the night before the hunting expedition, the way her bloodstone pendant had pulled her toward the forest. Even her growing feelings for Ulfar, had any of it been real or all elaborate manipulation? The blood sacrifice was never about the captured villagers, she realized aloud. It was about us. Our bond, corrupted by your blade, was meant to provide the power for your manifestation. "Precisely," Malakar applauded with genuine delight. "The chosen pair, willingly united and mystically bonded, would have provided enough concentrated life force to fuel my return for centuries. All I needed was for you to complete the final ritual, to consummate your union fully and permanently, seal the connection." Astrid stepped forward, her face set with grim determination. "But they haven't completed it. The bond is still forming, still vulnerable to disruption." "True," the sorcerer acknowledged, "which is why I'm prepared to offer a bargain. Complete the ritual willingly, and I'll release all the prisoners unharmed. Refuse, and I'll simply take what I need from their life force instead. The choice is yours. But choose quickly. The new moon rises in 3 hours, and after that, the opportunity passes." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Around them, Brynhild could see their friends and allies processing the implications, understanding that their greatest hope had been turned into their greatest vulnerability. The wolf cloak around Ulfar's shoulders dulled its protective gleam, as if even it were affected by the revelation of their compromised bond. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "I'm afraid not," Malachar replied with false regret. "You see, the blood oath blade creates a connection that can only be severed in two ways, by completing the ritual it began, or by the death of one of the bonded pair. And since I need that connection to remain intact for my purposes." He didn't need to finish the threat. They all understood that any attempt to break the mystical bond would result in immediate attack on the prisoners, and probably their deaths as well. "How long do we have to decide?" Ulfar asked, his voice steady despite the impossible choice before them. Malachar consulted the sky, where storm clouds were gathering with unnatural speed. "Until sunset. After that, I begin the alternative ritual, and your people start dying to fuel my return." As the sorcerer faded back into shadow, leaving them alone with the weight of his ultimatum, Brynhild felt the iron ring on her finger grow cold as ice. Everything they'd thought they knew about their destiny, about their purpose, had been revealed as elaborate deception. But perhaps, she thought with growing determination, knowing the truth might finally give them the weapon they needed to fight back. The council that followed Malachar's ultimatum was held in the Longhouse, but the usual formalities were abandoned in favor of desperate efficiency. Maps covered every available surface, marked with the positions of enemy forces, potential escape routes, and the locations where prisoners were being held. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, each passing moment a reminder of their dwindling time. "We can't trust anything about the bond now," Gunnar said bluntly, his red beard bristling with frustration. "If the bastard's been manipulating it from the beginning, how do we know our own thoughts are genuine?" "The manipulation works through the blade," Astrid corrected, studying ancient texts she'd brought from her private collection. "It can influence actions and decisions, but it can't change the fundamental nature of who you are. Your feelings for each other, those are real, even if the circumstances that revealed them were orchestrated." Brynhild found small comfort in the wise woman's words. Sitting beside Ulfar, she could still feel the warmth of their connection, but now it carried an undertone of uncertainty that made her question every impulse, every emotion. How much of what she felt was genuine love, and how much was magical compulsion designed to serve an enemy's plans? "Even if the feelings are real, the bond is compromised," Ulfar said quietly. "We can't complete the ritual knowing it will give Malachar exactly what he wants. But we can't abandon the prisoners either," Ragnar added from across the table. His own people were among the captives, taken in the coordinated raids that had preceded the current siege. 100 innocent lives against whatever power completing your bond would give the Shadow Lord. It's an impossible choice. That's when Astrid produced the Shield of Ancestors, unwrapping it from layers of protective cloth with reverent care. The shield was ancient beyond measure, its bronze surface green with age, but unmarked by battle damage. Across its face, intricate spirals and knotwork patterns seemed to move in the shifting light, and when Brynhild looked closely, she could swear she saw faces in the metalwork generations of her foremothers, watching with expectant eyes. "This belonged to the first of your bloodline to settle in these lands," Astrid explained, setting the shield carefully on the table. "She was a warrior smith who fought alongside her bondmate against the first shadow incursion over 200 years ago. According to the Chronicles, she discovered something about the nature of corrupted bonds, a way to purify them through sacrifice and will." "What kind of sacrifice?" Brynhild asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. "The bond-bearer must willingly accept the full weight of the corruption into herself, then use the combined power of both bloodlines to burn it away," Astrid read from a crumbling manuscript. "The process is described as walking through fire to emerge as forged steel, potentially fatal, but if successful, it creates a connection stronger and purer than anything that came before." Ulfar's face had gone pale. "You're talking about Brynhild deliberately taking a mystical poison into herself and hoping she's strong enough to survive the cure. The alternative is completing the ritual as Malachar wants it," Astrid replied steadily, which guarantees his victory and the destruction of everything we're trying to protect. The debate that followed was intense, but brief. They simply didn't have time for extended deliberation. Outside, the shadows were lengthening towards sunset, and scouts reported that the enemy forces were moving into final position around the stone circle where the prisoners were held. Whatever they decided to do, it would have to happen soon. "I'll do it," Brynhild said finally, cutting through the arguments with quiet determination. "The purification ritual. If there's a chance it can free us from Malakar's manipulation while keeping the prisoners alive, we have to try." "The risk," Ulfar began, but she silenced him with a look. "The risk is mine to take," she said firmly, "and if I die in the attempt, at least the bond dies with me. Malakar loses his primary source of power, and you'll be free to fight him without magical compulsion." The plan that emerged from their desperate brainstorming was audacious to the point of madness. They would appear to comply with Malakar's ultimatum, meeting him at the stone circle as if to complete the bonding ritual. But instead of giving him what he expected, Brynhild would attempt the purification, while Ulfar and the combined warbands launched a coordinated assault on the enemy forces. "The timing will be critical," Ragnar emphasized, marking positions on a map of the stone circle. "The moment Brynhild begins the purification, every shadow-touched warrior in the area will know something's wrong. We'll have minutes at most before they converge on our position." "Then we'd better make those minutes count," Gunnar replied grimly, checking the edge on his battle-axe. As they finalized their preparations, Brynhild found herself drawn to the forge one last time. The familiar weight of hammer and tongs felt comforting after the day's revelations about magical manipulation and ancient prophecies. Here, at least, the relationship between intention and result was straightforward. Heat metal, shape it, quench it, and you had something useful and true. But tonight, she wouldn't be forging weapons or tools. Following instructions from the ancient texts, she began working on something far more personal, a pair of matching braces, one for herself and one for Ulfar, designed to channel and focus their combined magical energies during the purification ritual. The work was unlike anything she'd attempted before. The bronze had to be heated to precise temperatures, while specific runes were inscribed into its surface. Each symbol had to be perfect, carved with absolute concentration, while the metal remained malleable. A single mistake would render the braces useless, and they wouldn't have time for a second attempt. As she worked, Ulfar sat nearby, maintaining the bellows and occasionally adding fuel to the fire. They spoke little, but his presence was steadying, a reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. Whether their bond had begun through manipulation or genuine attraction, what it had become felt real and worth protecting. "Are you afraid?" he asked, as she began the final quenching process. "Terrified," she admitted without looking up from her work, "but not of dying. I'm afraid that even if the purification works, we'll discover there was nothing real between us, that everything I feel was just magical compulsion dressed up as love. And I'm afraid the opposite is true," he replied quietly, "that what I feel for you is so real it would survive even if the magic disappeared entirely, and that I'll have to live with losing you to save people I've sworn to protect." The braces emerged from the quenching bath with a soft chime, their bronze surfaces gleaming with inner light. The runes carved into their surfaces pulsed gently, responding to the proximity of their destined wearers. They were beautiful, powerful, and potentially deadly, like the love that had inspired their creation. As the sun touched the western horizon, turning the sky deep red, the war bands assembled for their desperate gambit. Warriors from 3 clans stood together, united by necessity and grim determination. They knew the odds were against them, shadow-touched enemies outnumbered them significantly, and they were fighting on ground chosen by their opponents. But they also carried something their enemies lacked, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of others. the same impulse that had driven Brynhild to step in front of an assassin's arrow and set all these events in motion. "Whatever happens tonight," Ulfar said as they prepared to leave for the stone circle, "I want you to know that loving you, magic or no magic, manipulation or destiny, has been the greatest honor of my life." Brynhild slipped the bronze bracer over his wrist, feeling the immediate surge of power as their magical connection strengthened. "Then let's make sure we both live to explore that honor properly," she replied, fastening her own bracer in place. The shield of ancestors hung at her back, its ancient bronze warm against her spine. In her hands, she carried the tools she'd need for the purification ritual, not weapons, but instruments of transformation. Around them, the warbands moved out in careful formation, each group knowing their role in the coming battle. As they approached the stone circle where their enemies waited, Brynhild could feel the corrupted bond pulling at her consciousness, trying to influence her decisions and weaken her resolve. But she also felt something else, the pure, clean connection that existed beneath the manipulation, burning like a forge fire in the darkness. Tonight, she would either purify that connection or die in the attempt. Either way, Malakar's long-laid plans were about to encounter the one thing he hadn't accounted for, the stubborn refusal of ordinary people to surrender what they loved without a fight. The stone circle dominated a hilltop clearing that had been ancient when the first Norse settlers arrived in these lands. 13 granite monoliths formed a perfect ring around a central altar stone, their surfaces carved with symbols that predated any written language. Tonight, torches blazed between each stone, casting dancing shadows that made the carved runes seem to writhe with malevolent life. At the circle's heart, the heart of winter hung suspended above the altar on chains of black iron, a crystal the size of a man's head that pulsed with cold, blue light. The artifact drew the eye and chilled the soul, radiating power that felt older and more alien than anything in the mortal realm. Around its base, the captured villagers knelt in neat rows, their faces blank with enchantment, but their eyes wide with trapped terror. Malakar waited beside the altar, no longer bothering to maintain his handsome human facade. Shadow writhed around his form like living smoke, and his true face showed the ravages of centuries spent trafficking with powers that demanded payment in corruption and pain. When he smiled at their approach, his teeth gleamed like polished bone in the torchlight. "Punctual, as always," he said with mock warmth. "I do appreciate people who understand the value of keeping appointments." Brynhild and Ulfar walked hand in hand across the threshold of the stone circle, and immediately she felt the change. The corrupted bond that connected them flared with sudden intensity, trying to override her will and force compliance with whatever commands the sorcerer might give. But the bronze bracers held firm, their protective runes glowing with steady light as they channeled her determination into magical resistance. "Something's different," Malakar observed, his pale eyes narrowing as he studied their approach. "The bond feels muted. Have you been experimenting with protections, my dear?" "Just ensuring we can make this choice freely," Brynhild replied, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her chest. Around the circle's perimeter, shadow-touched warriors stood at attention, their dark armor reflecting the torchlight like scales on some massive serpent. "Choice," the sorcerer repeated with amusement. "How wonderfully naive, as if anyone in this situation has meaningful choices remaining." He gestured toward the heart of winter, and its pulsing light intensified. Immediately, the kneeling prisoners began to moan in unison, their life force being slowly drawn into the crystal's hungry depths. The effect was subtle, but unmistakably lethal. They had minutes before the drain became irreversible. "The ritual begins now," Malakar announced, raising the blood oath blade above his head. "Complete your bonding willingly, and I'll release them unharmed. Refuse, and their essence feeds my manifestation instead." This was the moment their desperate plan hinged on. Brynhild squeezed Ulfar's hand once, feeling his answering pressure, then stepped forward as if to comply with the sorcerer's demands. But instead of approaching the altar, she moved to the exact center of the stone circle and raised the shield of ancestors above her head. "I call upon the bloodline that flows in my veins," she proclaimed, her voice carrying clearly across the hilltop. "I claim the right of purification, the trial by fire that burns away all falsehood." The reaction was immediate and violent. The shield blazed with golden light that made the torches look dim by comparison, and Malakar's face contorted with rage as he realized he'd been deceived. "You little fool, do you have any idea what you're attempting?" "I'm taking back what was stolen from us," Brynhild replied, feeling the ancient power of her foremothers flowing through the shield and into her body. The sensation was like drinking liquid fire, painful but purifying, burning away the subtle manipulations that had been woven into her bond with Ulfar. But the process was more agonizing than she'd expected. Every nerve in her body felt as if it were being flayed with molten metal, and she could taste blood where she'd bitten through her tongue trying not to scream. The corruption fought back, trying to drag her consciousness down into darkness where Malakar's will could reassert control. That's when Ulfar stepped beside her, his own bracer blazing with answering light as he added his strength to hers. "Together," he said simply. And suddenly, the pain became bearable, shared between them in a way that felt completely natural. The combined power of their purified connection lanced upward like a pillar of golden flame, and where it touched the heart of winter, cracks began to appear in the ancient crystal. Malakar shrieked with fury, realizing that his primary focus for dark magic was being destroyed by the very ritual he'd manipulated them into performing. "Kill them!" he commanded his shadow-touched warriors. "Stop the ritual before they destroy everything." But even as the dark soldiers charged inward, war cries echoed from beyond the stone circle. Ragnar's forces struck the enemy's eastern flank, while Gunnar led the assault from the west, catching the shadow-touched warriors between hammer and anvil. Steel rang against unnatural armor as the battle for the prisoners' lives began in earnest. In the center of the chaos, Brynhild felt the purification reaching its climax. The shield of ancestors had grown almost too hot to hold, but she maintained her grip through sheer determination, knowing that dropping it now would doom everyone she cared about. The heart of winter cracked completely, its stolen power bleeding away in streams of cold fire that dispersed harmlessly into the night sky. The destruction of the heart of winter sent shockwaves through both the physical and mystical realms. As the ancient crystal shattered completely, the prisoners collapsed forward, gasping as their life force returned to them in a rush of warmth and vitality. But Malakar was far from defeated, if anything. The loss of his primary focus seemed to have driven him into a rage that transcended mortal understanding. "Centuries of preparation?" he snarled, shadow writhing around his form as he abandoned the last pretense of humanity. "Centuries of careful planning, ruined by two ignorant children who think love conquers all." The sorcerer raised the blood oath blade, and its corrupted metal began to resonate with a sound like screaming wind. But instead of trying to reassert control over their bond, he was doing something far more dangerous, attempting to sever it completely, regardless of what the violent separation might do to them. "If I cannot have your power willingly," Malakar declared, "then I'll take what I can from your dying bodies." The blade descended toward the space between them, but it never completed its arc. From the shadows at the circle's edge, a new figure emerged. Astrid, carrying in her hands an artifact none of them had seen before. The soul mirror was perfectly circular, its surface reflecting not the physical world, but the true nature of everything it looked upon. "Look upon yourself, Malakar," the wise woman commanded, turning the mirror toward the sorcerer. "See what you've truly become." The effect was immediate and devastating. Malakar's scream of rage became a howl of anguish as the mirror showed him not the powerful lord of shadow he imagined himself to be, but the withered, hollow thing he'd actually become. Centuries of trafficking with dark powers had eaten away at his soul until nothing remained but hunger and hatred, wearing the memory of a man like an ill-fitting costume. "No!" he shrieked, trying to cover his eyes, but the mirror's truth could not be avoided once it had been revealed. "I am mighty, I am eternal, I am nothing," Brynhild finished, feeling the purification ritual reach its completion. The golden fire that surrounded her and Ulfar blazed brighter than the sun, burning away the last traces of corruption from their bond. In its place, something new took shape, a connection forged, not by prophecy or manipulation, but by choice, freely made in full knowledge of the cost. The purified magic lanced outward from their joined hands, not as a weapon but as a revelation. Every shadow-touched warrior in the stone circle suddenly saw themselves as they truly were, not superhuman servants of a great cause, but broken souls enslaved by promises of power that had never been real. Some collapsed in despair, but others turned on their former master with the fury of the deceived. Malakar, still reeling from the soul mirror's truth, found himself facing not just the chosen pair, but every person he'd ever manipulated or betrayed. The prisoners he'd planned to sacrifice stood with righteous anger blazing in their eyes. The shadow-touched warriors he'd enslaved broke their mystical chains and reached for weapons with hands suddenly free to choose their own actions. "This is impossible," he gasped, backing toward the shattered remains of the Heart of Winter. "The dark powers promised me eternal dominion. The Bone Throne is mine by right." "The Bone Throne is empty," Astrid said calmly, still holding the soul mirror steady. "It has been empty since the last Shadow Lord fell 60 years ago. You've been serving nothing but your own delusions, feeding power to a void that can never be filled." The revelation was the final blow. Malakar's form began to dissolve as the truth unmade the lies that had sustained him for so long. Without the stolen life force of the Heart of Winter, without the corrupted bond to provide fresh power, without even the false strength of his own self-deception, there was nothing left to hold his essence together. "Remember this," Brynhild called out as the sorcerer faded into nothingness. "True power comes not from taking what belongs to others, but from giving freely of what you have." The battle ended not with clashing steel, but with embraces as former enemies recognized each other as fellow victims of a master manipulator's schemes. The shadow-touched warriors, freed from their mystical bonds, wept openly as they remembered the families and homes they'd left behind. The prisoners helped each other to their feet, supporting those too weak to stand alone. In the center of the stone circle, Ulfar and Brynhild stood hand in hand as the last of the purification fire faded around them. Their bond remained, but it felt completely different now, not a mystical compulsion, but a conscious choice, renewed moment by moment through trust and understanding. "Is it over?" Ulfar asked, looking around at the peaceful scene that had moments before been a battlefield. Brynhild felt the answer deep in her bones, in the quiet place where the purified magic rested like banked coals, ready to blaze again if needed. "This part is over, but I think our real adventure is just beginning." The soul mirror in Astrid's hands reflected their faces, as they truly were no longer puppets dancing to an ancient prophecy, but two people who had chosen love over fear, truth over comfortable illusion, and each other over the safer path of solitude. It was, Brynhild thought, the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. 3 months after the battle at the Stone Circle, Ironhold had transformed from a village focused on mere survival to a thriving center of learning and cooperation. The boundary stones still glowed with their protective blue light, but now that radiance felt warm and welcoming rather than urgent and warning. Children played in their shadows without fear, and the runes carved into the ancient granite had begun teaching themselves to anyone who spent time studying them. Brynhild stood in her expanded forge, watching apprentices from 3 different clans work alongside each other with the easy camaraderie that came from shared purpose. The forge itself had grown beyond anything her father could have imagined, not just larger, but somehow more than the sum of its physical components. The fire burned cleaner and hotter than natural flame, fed by the residual magic that still flowed through her bloodline. The tools responded to intention as much as skill, and the metal seemed eager to take whatever shape would serve the greatest good. But it was the artifact displayed on the wall above the main workbench that drew the most attention from visitors. The wedding bracer was unlike anything that had ever been forged in the mortal realm, not quite bronze, not quite silver, but some new alloy that seemed to contain traces of starlight and forge fire in equal measure. Its surface was smooth as silk, but warm to the touch, and the runes that decorated its length told the story of two people who had chosen love over destiny, truth over comfort, and each other over the safer path of solitude. "Still admiring your own work?" Ulfar's voice came from the doorway, warm with affection and gentle teasing. He wore practical clothes now, rather than the ceremonial garb of leadership: wool tunic, leather breeches, sturdy boots designed for walking among his people rather than standing above them. The wolf cloak draped over his shoulders had settled into a comfortable presence, its protective magic ready but unobtrusive. "Admiring the story it tells," Brynhild corrected, setting down the hammer she'd been using to shape a particularly stubborn piece of iron. "Every line represents something we chose, rather than something we were forced to accept." The bracer had been forged from the remnants of all the other artifacts that had played their parts in their story. The iron ring that had first marked their bond melted down and reformed. Fragments of the boundary stones, freely given when their protective power was no longer needed in such concentration. Shavings from the war horn of calling, the seeing bowl, even tiny pieces of the shattered heart of winter, purified by the soul mirror's truth until they held only the memory of redemption rather than corruption. "The delegation from the southern kingdoms arrived this morning," Ulfar reported, moving to stand beside her at the workbench. "They want to establish a permanent embassy here, learn our methods for dealing with supernatural threats." "And what did you tell them?" "That they're welcome to send scholars and observers, but that what we've learned can't be taught through books or lectures," he replied, sliding his arm around her waist with the casual intimacy that had replaced their earlier awkward courtship. "It has to be lived, chosen, earned through sacrifice and trust." Through the open windows of the forge, they could hear the sounds of the expanded village children, learning to read, using texts that combined practical knowledge with the old stories. Former enemies working together to rebuild farmsteads, destroyed in the shadow raids, and always the underlying hum of contentment that came from people who knew they were safe and valued. "Astrid thinks we should write down what happened," Brynhild said, leaning into the warmth of his embrace. "Create a record for future generations who might face similar threats. What do you think?" She considered the question seriously, watching as one of her apprentices successfully forged a blade that gleamed with the faintest hint of protective magic. The young woman had the gift, though she came from farmer stock rather than smith bloodline. It seemed that the events at the stone circle had awakened potential in many people, as if proximity to freely chosen love had reminded them of their own capacity for growth and change. "I think every generation has to find their own path to truth," she said finally. "We can share the principles that love freely given is stronger than power taken by force, that truth revealed is mightier than comfortable lies, that choosing each other despite fear is braver than avoiding risk altogether. But the specific way those principles manifest, that has to be discovered fresh each time." The sun was setting over the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded them both of the purification fire that had burned away everything false between them. In a few hours, they would gather with friends and family for the evening meal, sharing food and stories in the great longhouse that now served the entire community rather than just the clan leadership. But first, they had this quiet moment in the place where their love had been literally forged into something stronger than prophecy or manipulation. The wedding bracer caught the last rays of sunlight and reflected them back as something even more beautiful, the radiance of two souls who had found each other not because fate demanded it, but because they had chosen to be worthy of such a gift. "Any regrets?" Ulfar asked softly, the question he'd been asking every few days since their bond was purified. "Only one," Brynhild replied, rising on her toes to kiss him, "that we waited so long to trust what we felt. Then tomorrow we'll choose each other again," he said, and that promise renewed daily, earned constantly, never taken for granted, was worth more than all the ancient prophecies and magical artifacts combined. Outside their window, the boundary stones pulsed once with gentle light, as if blessing their continued commitment to love, freely chosen over destiny blindly followed. Sometimes, they had learned, the greatest magic was simply deciding to believe in each other.